A little more than 30 years ago, one of Earth's largest flying birds almost disappeared to extinction. In 1987, only 27 California condors remained alive, and they were a species in crisis. Today, thanks to the work of dedicated conservationists and staunch public support, the population of California condors has rebounded to nearly 500 individuals. While this number represents a tremendous success, it also underscores the recovery of condors has a long way to go before they are no longer threatened with extinction. Hi, everyone. This is Mike Fitz, your resident naturalist with Explore.org, the world's largest live nature cam network. I'm joined today by Joe Burnett, the Condor Program Manager and Senior Wildlife Biologist with the Ventana Wildlife Society. In the 1990s, Joe coordinated the first releases of captive condors into Central California. His leadership and knowledge have been instrumental in the condors' continued recovery. Joe is here to discuss condors, their recovery efforts, and some of the condor storylines that you can follow this year on Explore.org's cameras. Joe, thanks for joining me today.
Hey, thank you, Mike. It's on behalf of Ventana Wildlife Society. I'm really glad to be here, and we're excited to partner with you guys this year.
I am too. I'm really looking forward to watching the condor cameras and learning more about condors. So these are one of these, I think, species that really does serve as an iconic symbol of the modern conservation movement and our dedication to try to protect, biodiversity on the planet. A lot of people, have heard about condors, but many of us haven't really had the chance to see a live condor in the wild or to observe their behaviors. I've been lucky enough just to see condors twice in my life, so it's not really a species that I'm exposed to very often. It's a species that I have a lot of experience with. So maybe we can get into some of the basics of condors at the beginning of our discussion here. Could you describe, what niche condors occupy in their ecosystem?
Sure. As everyone knows, condors are vultures. They're part of the New World vulture family, Gymnogyps californianus. And they're scavenging, and I think their key role in the ecosystem is they're nature's cleanup crew. They're out there cleaning up dead stuff, whether it be on the coast or inland, feeding on, like in this video you're seeing, they're very, very efficient. And as a group, they can basically consume a whale in a matter of a few weeks. So, or a large cow. So their role is really, really important in terms of recycling kind of the dead stuff out there.
And I think that's an unenviable task from a human perspective, but for them, that seems to be, they probably are maybe most happy when they have their face shoved into a carcass just like that. They're also, they're very, very large birds. They have about a 9-foot wingspan when they're fully grown. So, and that's makes them one of North America's largest birds. But it's sometimes difficult to judge, their size when you see like a condor or some of these other large soaring birds in the sky. So how can condors be differentiated from other birds that might superficially resemble them? You mentioned that they're members of the vulture family, so they closely resemble a turkey. If you're looking at a condor in the sky, what are some of those field marks that you might want to look for to know that you're looking at a condor?
Yeah, that's probably the most common thing that happens is people think they've seen a condor and they haven't. And one of the most distinguishable patterns is they have large white triangular patterns underneath on each wing, on the underside of the wing. And it's very noticeable if they're flying somewhat close, and they soar in large circular patterns. And you're not going to see a condor flapping a lot because those big 9 to 10 foot wingspans take a lot of energy every time they flap. So like in this photo, this is really quintessential condor soaring. They're nature's perfect glider. And, they're commonly mistaken for golden eagles, which a good way to distinguish golden eagles and condors is the golden eagle will have a white tail band. And also they'll flap a bit more. They have a little more of a, they're hunting the landscape a lot more than condors. And so those are some of the easiest ways to do it. And just the mere size. If you have another bird and flying with them, it's pretty easy because condors are substantially larger than anything out there.
And they also live substantially longer than most birds. I've been reading. What's their lifespan like?
Yeah, you know, in the wild, we believe it's at least 50 to 60 years. There's condors in captivity that have hit the 70 to 80-year-old mark, but again, they're in a captive situation. We think in the wild, under the natural pressures of the environment, that we think they're, so you know, they're very long-lived, and yeah, and that comes into their whole breeding strategy. You know, they don't begin breeding until they're 6 to 8 years old, and they only nest every other year, raising one chick at a time. So they're long-lived, slow breeding, which is not something you typically identify with a bird. You know, you identify that with a mammal, you know, or like a grizzly bear or a mountain lion. So I think that's a pretty fascinating aspect of condors.
And another aspect of their lives that maybe most people don't associate with birds is that you know, these condors are very social birds. They have a very social life. Could you describe a little bit about what their social life is like?
Yeah, I mean that's probably, as a biologist, that's probably one of the coolest things that I've come to learn about condors is they have the Condor society is very hierarchical. So it has a dominance hierarchy that governs who feeds first. For example, if a dominant bird walks up to a carcass, the other young birds part. So as you gain dominance, it also you're able to use that and leverage when you go to nest and pick the best territories. Very similar to what you see with primates. And in the field, we call them, you know, our term for condors is they're flying primates, because their behavior is so interesting and parallels so many what you see with mammals and primates.
And in that last clip, we saw just a little bit of some posturing among, you know, the condors. Is that one of the things that, you know, if we're watching the condor cam at the Ventata, you know, sanctuary, that wide wingspan like that, is that sort of like a threat posture? That they're, hey, I'm approaching you with my wings spread, you might want to back off.
Yeah, there's a whole multitude of behaviors they use. The most dominant birds actually have to do very little because they've already established themselves. It's usually the birds posturing the most are usually the most have the most to lose. I mean, have the most to gain.
Okay.
Yeah, it's really counterintuitive since we've been watching them, but it's really fun. I think that's it's interesting to see viewer comments when they see condors feeding, because it's we are actually learning with them in a way, because again, condors, before they almost died out, there was very little known about them. So that's been one of the more interesting great parts about working with condors, is we're learning as we go. And the more, I mean, we're just learning more and more about how fascinating these birds are and how complex their behavior is. But yeah, they use I think one of the really cool social things is most of their behavior is nonverbal. Like you were talking about posturing. They actually don't possess vocal cords, so they can make hissing and grunting noises like you would hear from a reptile, but their majority of their behavior as we see it is basically the adults will change the head coloration as they come to breeding. There's different, just real subtle posturing that obviously communicates a lot and what everything they need for Condor society. So, and I guess humans, we as well use a lot of nonverbal communication and across the animal kingdom, but it's really interesting to see a species that uses so much of it.
And a couple of those clips that we were just looking at were from the Ventata Wildlife Society's Condor Sanctuary, you know, off the coast of Big Sur, up in the mountains. Is there, you know, we've talked a little bit about the hierarchy so far, but are there like a couple of birds or more that maybe are more dominant, that when there's feedings going on the camera that we're watching, are there like a couple that we could say, hey, yeah, those are maybe two of the birds that, or three of the birds that are more likely to be dominant in that group, that feeding aggregation?
Yeah, our most dominant bird, he's kind of been the reigning king for years. I have his tag right here. It's number 167, and he's followed by some other birds real close. There's a real close at the top. It's pretty tight. And so, you know, some of the typical dominant birds you're going to see are 167, 209. And again, on our website, we link to those birds and you can read about their personalities, and we actually have nicknames for them. Obviously, 167, we named him Kingpin because he basically is the kingpin of the flock. And we have a little fun with it. For the scientific purposes, just like you see with other wildlife projects, the 3-digit number is the master number for the bird. That's the number we track with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But to engage folks and get people more to identify with the individual personalities of the birds, we also give them these nicknames. And they definitely all do possess individual personalities. And anytime you have a hierarchy like that and this kind of social behavior, you're going to have very individual type birds come out. And having worked with this flock from the beginning for over 20 years, I mean, I've known these birds since they were first released. 167, I released him as a pretty young, about 1 year old. Now he's over 20. So I've gotten to see this bird. I've been able to see this bird grow through all these life stages and almost learn with him. And it's, it's been a roller coaster ride for sure. But, to see some of these birds making it to the 20-year mark is pretty amazing.
And, that is something that was actually kind of in question, 20, 30 years ago, the status of this population. And maybe before we get into like the story of condor conservation in the last few decades, we can back up a little bit. I'd like to go back actually, not just a few decades, but let's go back, many thousands of years. California condors are currently found just in parts of, California, northern Arizona. There's a few in southern Utah and a few in Baja, Mexico. But this contrasts like greatly from the past. During the Pleistocene, at the end of the last ice age, what does the fossil record tell us about their former distribution?
Yeah, I think that one of the most amazing, I was as surprised as well, but when we share with folks that there's fossil records going back into the Pleistocene that they have found condors, Gymnogyps californianus bones in New York State, Florida. So we know this species at one time, obviously a very long time ago, once was resident to the entire continent of North America. And so that I thought that was pretty amazing.
And then when if we could fast forward to just a few hundred years ago, when Europeans first arrived in North America, do we have a good idea of what their range might have been at that time?
Yeah, I think one of the big events that happened, obviously after the Ice Age, we lost a lot of megafauna, which I think was a big food source for condors across North America. And after the Ice Age, their range moved west of the Rockies. And then in the last 500 years, it moved closer to the coast. And again, it was kind of following the megafauna. And then in the last couple hundred years, when humans started having an impact on megafauna, being it buffalo or other large ungulates that were getting displaced, the range even moved closer to the coast. So yeah, that comes into the more recent times.
And then finally, yeah, the 20th century is really, it seems like when their population started to plummet, and we did almost lose them to extinction. So what led to that, I guess, nadir in their population?
Yeah, it was a combination of factors that happened over the last couple hundred years. Obviously, the first Europeans that came out in the gold rush, there were all these major events that happened. And as we settled the West, I think just hunting and shooting and collecting. I mean, condors were collected. It was, there was a huge prize on their head at one time. And then that moved up to, the fur trade, which almost wiped out, and the whaling and fur trade almost wiped out a lot of the coastal food sources for condors. And then you had just displacement of the native ungulates like deer, elk, with domestic cattle. And then there were these other events that were really disturbing, were these poisoning campaigns to rid California of grizzly bears. And they were intended for grizzly bears, but anything else that scavenged on these poison bait carcasses would fall victim. And knowing how condors are and how they congregate on carcasses, that there could have easily been big losses of condors in a very short period. So you combine that with what's happened over the last 50, 60 years, which the current leading threat to condors, which is lead poisoning from when the condors feed on carcasses and ingest spent lead ammunition. That's not only probably the last 50 years, but it's also, since we've been releasing condors, it still is a threat. And that's kind of basically the main issue that we're tackling right now with trying to help the species.
And before we get to that point about lead poisoning and indirect effects that maybe people are having on condors, I'd like to back up just a little bit and talk about that effort to reestablish a population in the wild, because during the late 1980s, I mean, they were essentially extinct in the wild. I remember as a kid, I'm going to date myself, I'm going to say, yeah, definitely a child of the 80s. I remember as a kid seeing footage of condors on the news and seeing, baby condors and the chicks being hand reared by puppets, and thinking to myself at that time as a young child, thinking, well, I mean, is this going to work? This seems really far-fetched. Again, maybe just 8, 9, 10 years old at the time, seeing this and wondering about the fate of condors, whether I would be able to see them in the wild as an adult. So, a lot of the remaining condors were captured. They were put in zoos as an effort to breed the birds in captivity. In hindsight, that seems like it was the right decision, the right move. But at the time, it was highly controversial. So could you discuss the reasoning and thought process that led to that decision to bring capture the condors from the wild, and try to captive rear them in zoos?
Yeah, I was in a similar situation as you. I was watching it unfold when I was younger. But, what I've come to learn is that, the conservation community was divided on this issue of whether we bring in all the condors, try to save them, or let them stay in the wild and let them die with dignity kind of an approach. It was not something, it was a tricky, both sides had good arguments. But once they caught the last free flying birds and saw how well they did in captivity and how well releases have gone, that conversation has changed, and it's definitely was the right decision to basically bring them in. And just I think a lot of folks felt that condors would lose for 15, 20 years. They might lose some of those innate ingrained behaviors. And fortunately, what we've seen, and it's not too surprising, is that they will pretty much never lose those core behaviors that shape them as a species. And what's really great is, as we've released the birds back out into the wild, they have just basically picked up right where they left off. And not to say there were some obstacles along the way, some learning curve issues, but that's expected anytime you're completely rebuilding a population. But now that we have birds 20 plus years old, when we release new birds, it's night and day compared to the early days when we were releasing. These guys have guide birds out there. They have mentors. They have it's much easier for these newer release birds, and it's just got a nice momentum, a nice inertia to it. And just in terms of what they're doing, everything they're doing is just what we read historically what condors did. So, and they're finding incredible places to nest. They're reconnecting with the old foraging grounds, stuff like that. So pretty amazing to watch. So yeah, it's nice to know that those innate behaviors never really leave a species.
And of course, they're still facing challenges in the wild. They're able to, they, like you mentioned, they never lost some of those innate behaviors. And while their population right now numbers around 500 individuals, and they're well protected by federal law, lead poisoning has to be one of those major threats to wild condors. In some of my research, I came across documentation of some condors with levels of lead in their blood that exceeds what is considered safe for human children. And some have been documented with lead levels at concentrations high enough to potentially kill a person. So how would they, attain this poison? And why is lead exposure so harmful to condors?
Yeah, I mean that's that's our biggest threat right now, and condors scavenge across a huge landscape. You got a species with a 10-foot wingspan that can fly up to 150 miles in a day searching for food. Um, and while they're out there looking for food, if they come across, they're opportunistic. If they come across a pig that's been shot, or say some ground squirrels that have been left out, usually when those animals are shot, they're pest animals, or they're kind of left on the landscape. And a condor comes along and forages on these carcasses. More often than not, if they use lead ammunition, there's leftover spent ammunition in the carcass they're consuming. And it only takes a small chunk, as you can see in this photo right here, just a small fragment, like a fingernail clipping. And that to a human would be incredibly toxic. But when you take, the average human is 100 plus pounds, whereas a condor, they weigh anywhere from 18 to 25 pounds. So that piece of lead has a much bigger effect in terms of toxicity. And that's right now, and since we've started the program, it is the #1 threat. And it's why the current rule went into effect that prohibits the use of lead ammunition for hunting or depredating animals in the whole entire state of California. And we hope this measure will be the start of a new trend for condors and a reduction in mortality from lead. Because we're pretty confident if we can get past the lead issue, this species will sustain themselves more than efficiently.
And the lead poisoning issue, is kind of exemplified by many different condors. You could probably pick out a bunch of different condors from your flock and look at their stories and how they've been treated for lead poisoning. When we were talking, a couple of weeks ago before the chat, you mentioned a story though of one condor in particular that seemed to resonate sort of the story of lead poisoning, and that was AC-8. She was like the last free-flying condor captured for the recovery program in the 1980s. She was the first to be released back into the wild. So can you tell us a little bit more about her story and how lead impacted her life?
Yeah, AC-8 was one of the, she was one of the remaining 27 birds. Her genetics were incredibly valuable to rebuilding the genetic stock of the species. And when she was brought in from the wild, her age was pretty much unknown. She had been identified in the 70s, but they didn't know how old she was. I mean, she could have been 50, 60 when she was brought in the 80s. And so she was brought in, I think in 86, and she captive bred for almost 15 years until she was completely genetically represented in the flock. And of course, that was at the time we said, man, she could really contribute to these release birds and sharing some of her knowledge of how she existed on the landscape. So the decision was made to release her back to the wild in 2001. And after about a year back out in the wild in Southern California, she came in with lead poisoning and had a lead fragment that she had ingested and was near death. She was taken to LA Zoo. They have state-of-the-art facility there to take, they have a captive breeding center for condors, and they also treat any of our real clinical, severely, lead poisoned birds. And again, their staff, their keepers, their vets did miraculous work to bring her back. She was right on the brink of death, and they brought her back and got her recovered. And after about 6 months in captivity, she was ready to release again, and she was re-released back out in the wild. And unfortunately, after spending not too long out there, I think it was in late 2002, she was found. She had been shot at point blank range by somebody that was out hunting basically out hunting pigs, saw AC-8 and shot her point blank range out of a tree. And it was a sad ending to such a great story of a bird. I mean, we always refer to her as Grandma Condor because she kind of represented she was one, basically took one for the team. And, so it was unfortunate that it ended that way. But again, it showed us that we needed to keep educating. I mean, obviously people are out there still that don't realize condors are protected. So it was an eye opener for us, and it was, but we used it as a teachable moment to basically help further the conservation. We don't want her legacy to be lost in all this.
And many condors still need to be treated for lead poisoning. Is that part of the reason why we see that enclosure on the Condor camera that's live right now on explore.org?
Yeah, so that enclosure you see is a release pin primarily, but we also use the release pin because they're familiar with it. A lot of these birds were released out and they have a comfort level with it. And what we do is we're able to use that same pin to bring them back in and recapture them, say to whether we're taking a blood sample to test for lead, or a bird's looking like it's ill, or we're replacing the radio transmitters, which are affixed to their wing next to their ID tag. And the radio transmitters are pretty crucial to everything we do. They tell us whether a bird, without these, condors fly such great distances. Biologists like myself would never be able to find these guys. And the most important thing they do is if a bird were to get sick and actually end up dying of lead poison, it allows us to recover them in a pretty quick manner. So we can preserve them and actually document, send them to Fish and Wildlife Service, and they can help us document how they died. And that helps us manage the threats to this species.
You were mentioning earlier, one way that you're trying to manage the threat to these species is reduce the levels of lead in the wild. Recently, you said you could, or actually maybe I should let you explain more about that law that took place that basically bans lead ammunition in the state of California within the Condor's range. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that and how you think that will help the species?
Yeah, we've collected so much data over the years on condors. It finally hit a tipping point where legislation went through and a law passed to prohibit the use of lead ammunition in all of California, whether it be for, because historically the waterfowl were protected. I don't know if everyone knows that, but they banned birdshot, lead birdshot, and switched to steel. And so with what our situation is very similar in that it's the lead that's the issue. It's not necessarily the bullet. So we're asking hunters and ranchers to switch to a non-lead bullet, and it's basically a copper base. There's different types of alloys, but they don't have lead. And so it's not a hunting issue. It's just more a way to switch. Keep doing what you're doing, within the, obviously within the fish and game rules, but use this other type of bullet that's actually safer for not only condors. I think everyone realizes that, and I see the cams, so many cams with bald eagles on your guys' site. Bald eagles are definitely as susceptible as condors to lead, and so are golden eagles. All these species are known predators, but they also scavenge quite a bit. I think bald eagles probably scavenge more so than golden eagles, but they also have been impacted by lead poisoning. So this not only helps condors, it's a benefit to the whole ecosystem. We've obviously taken lead out of paint. We've taken lead out of gasoline. Anywhere you use lead is potentially, especially when there's potentially ingestion by wildlife, has to be dealt with sensitively. And that's why we really feel strongly that this will help reduce lead deaths among condors, and that will get us over the hump in terms of letting these birds get to a self-sustaining population.
And I think that's such an important point too. When we can reduce, the amount of lead in the environment, it has benefits not just for condors, but for a whole host of other species. So yeah, if you're a hunter, you're an angler, really do consider strongly, even if the law doesn't require it, consider strongly switching to some of those other non-lead options. Even when you're fishing too, a lot of lead split shots that you put on your line to weight your line is still made out of lead, and loons, other diving birds still consume those things. So yeah, I think that's such an important point for everyone to consider at home, because the condor population, isn't at that point yet where it's quite considered maybe a self-sustaining population. So is it what do you think would it take to get them to that level? Is it just the lead issue, or is there, we're looking at more educational efforts to just let people know about condors and their protected status and their place in the ecosystem?
Yeah, I think, yeah, we're convinced. We've done enough research on the subject to know that lead is the number one. It far above any other threats. It stands alone. So
Okay.
we're pretty convinced that, looking at our survival models, that if we can get just even put a dent in the lead deaths, that we're going to be really close, because we know the birds can reproduce well on their own. They're feeding on their own. The genetics are great. We really are just at this last hurdle with lead poisoning. There have been threats over the years that have been much more minor. Even power line strikes, just like with a lot of raptors. Condors are susceptible to those, but we've worked with those. Those have been real isolated. And like I said before about the shooting, fortunately, those haven't happened very often. And in the last 10 years, we definitely have seen, it's a pretty rare occurrence. So we know folks are getting educated on that front. So I think this is just a tricky one, in that, folks have used lead ammunition forever, and it's just like anytime you have a change, it just takes a little time. And so that's why we as an organization are helping hunters and ranchers switch to non-lead ammo and help in providing free non-lead ammo to these guys if they need it.
So I think the future of condors is definitely looking up. So I'm excited to see what the next few decades bring for this species. I'm also really excited to watch the condor cams this winter. We have that one on explore.org right now, partnering with the Ventada Wildlife Society in Big Sur at the feeding site. But we're going to bring online fairly soon a condor nesting cam. So what can we expect to see on that cam this year?
Kind of similar to what you're seeing now, but it's going to be much more high quality. Thanks to you guys, we've upgraded the camera this year in this redwood nest. Condor 167 and 190, our oldest pair, our most experienced pair, our most dominant pair, are online to nest again in this awesome redwood nest. It's a pretty spectacular spot to see a yet alone climb up in there and put nest cams in. So we went in earlier in between the nest season, when it was quiet up there, we snuck in and put this new camera in. And yeah, we're pretty excited because the technology is getting better, and we're excited to basically just see what more we can learn about these guys, and then also just help educate folks, because I think there's just something, even when I watch your guys' other nest cams, there's just something amazing about watching animals raise their young. I think it's as innate, to all of us as it is to them. I think people are fascinated by just how sensitive and how nurturing these species can be, that appear very, they appear very intimidating, but then when you see them raising a chick, it's no different than any other animal. So I think it's pretty. I think the value in it is pretty amazing.
And just a couple other quick questions for you before we conclude the chat. I'm so much looking forward to that condor nesting cam. But what's it like, to be able to see these animals up close? You've had the opportunity to handle them as part of your work, and being close to them frequently as part of your research. So what's it really like to see these animals up close?
Yeah, it's hard to put into words. I just put it. It's just unbelievable I think the first thing that hits you is that there's a bird this big that still exists, and then I think about how for such a big bird, how graceful they are, how much they command that sky. I mean, they are master flyers, and you can't help but immediately just kind of step back and be taken by such a large, masterful flying bird, and you just immediately go, these guys belong here, and you immediately feel like they have a distinct role, an important role in the ecosystem. It kind of just all comes and hits on a head. And I think to this day, it's one of my favorite things is to be with somebody when they see a condor for the first time. I think I relive the times I see it. And to this day, I still just, every time I see one, is just takes your breath away.
And you also mentioned, that you admire their care, their parental skills. Are there any other factors about condors that you admire, particularly would like to share with the audience at home?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, I really admire them. Just over the years working with them, how resilient they are. They are one of the most incredible survivors. Just the various environments they can thrive in. I mean, they can go from snow to coastal socked in fog to desert. I mean, they're one of the more really durable animals I've ever seen. And I feel like I love the behavior part. I mean, the part that this relation they have to primates, this hierarchy is still just fascinates me to this day. And I think we're just scratching the surface in what we know about that. And just as a biologist, I've just been honored to work with them. And they're just one of the, I came in at such a cool time, and I just feel blessed I got the opportunity. So I'm learning with them, and I always tell people that we don't really know a whole lot. We're still learning. There's still a lot to be learned. And again, I think saving this species has bigger implications than we can ever imagine.
And for me, condors, they represent a connection to the past and future of North American wildlife. I mean, they once shared this landscape with mastodons and dire wolves, saber-toothed cats. North America is a much different place today than what they had in the past. But there's still a place here for condors, as long as the public, remains committed to their recovery and survival. And I think that's the storyline going forward with, biodiversity on the planet, not being in a great state right now. We're affecting wildlife and plants across the globe in very detrimental ways, with a lot of species going extinct. But condors, definitely show that there is hope as long as we're committed to that. So I think, these birds to me are just really amazing for their connections to the past and the future.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that connection they have, and just, it's kind of the classic thing. Once you get them out there, they know what to do, and you really just have to clear the pathway for them. For humans, it's just getting out of their way and just letting them do what they need to do. And they've shown us that, I think that what they've shown me is that there's lots of wild places left out there. I think people don't realize there's a lot of wild wilderness areas that are left. And the condors have shown us that there's plenty of places to nest. There's still plenty of food supply. The marine mammals have now rebounded to historic numbers. Whale populations have, in comparison to, when during the whaling times, have come back almost fourfold, so we're seeing these condors reconnect with these, historic sources that once weren't a part, probably led to their disappearance in the first place. So to see these things coming back, whether it be elk, pronghorn antelope restoration, there's just a lot of really great stuff going on. Yeah, I think the future looks really, really bright.
Well, it's been a fascinating conversation, Joe. I'd like to thank you for joining me today. Joe Burnett has been my guest on today's live chat. He's the senior wildlife biologist for the Ventada Wildlife Society. So, Joe, thanks once again for joining me.
Hey, thank you for having me, and we look forward to more of these.
And if you want to, yeah, absolutely, yeah, I think Joe is hoping to do more live chats as the condor nesting season starts, and we get to watch those condors nest in the redwood camera. So make sure to tune in to explore.org for updates on that. If you want, of course, to learn more about condors, please visit the Ventada Wildlife Society's website. That is ventadaws.org. It can also go to explore.org/condors to see the condor cam that we have up right now. Again, my name is Mike Fitz with explore.org. Thanks for joining us today, and never stop learning.